For 3 years, my boss stole every project I worked on and presented it as his own. He got promoted thanks to my work. I walked into a meeting with the CEO, exposed everything with proof, and this is what happened. I don't know exactly when it all started. If I had to point to a day, I'd say it was a Tuesday. Because it's always Tuesday when something breaks without making a sound. I joined the company with that mix of nerves and hunger you get when you feel like you've finally been given a real opportunity. It wasn't an amazing position, but it was enough. Junior analyst at a mid-sized consulting firm. Nothing glamorous, but with potential. And there he was. My boss. Rodrigo. That guy had a special ability to win people over in 5 minutes. The kind who smiles with all his teeth, calls you by your name from day one, and makes you feel like you're in good hands. And for the first few months, I believed it. I really believed it. I remember my first big project. I stayed up until 2 a.m. for several days straight, refining data, building presentations, polishing every detail like it was a piece of art no one was going to see. I handed it to Rodrigo with that feeling of, this is everything I'm capable of. He told me, good job, this is going to impress. And he was right, but not in the way I thought. 2 days later, there was a meeting with the client. I wasn't invited. Fair enough, I thought. I was new. But one of the guys on the team texted me, hey, is that your presentation? I felt something off. Like when your stomach drops out of nowhere. I replied, yeah, why? And he sent me a picture. There it was. My presentation. My charts. My corrected mistakes. Even a slide I had redone 3 times because I wasn't satisfied with it, but with Rodrigo's name on the cover. And him, explaining everything as if he had built it from scratch. I didn't say anything that day. I convinced myself it was normal. That this is how things worked. That he was the boss and, technically, everything the team did went through him. That's what I told myself so I could sleep at night. Spoiler, it didn't work, but I let it go. Mistake number 1. The second project was worse, because it wasn't a surprise anymore. It was a pattern. This time, I was in the meeting, and I saw it happen in real time. Rodrigo presenting my work, but not just that, telling it as if it were his original idea. What I thought was, when I analyzed the data, I decided the best strategy was every sentence felt like a clean little stab, and I sat there, taking notes like a supporting character in my own story. At one point, the client asked a technical question, a tough one. Rodrigo hesitated, just for a second, but I knew the answer, because I had done that analysis. I looked at him, he looked at me, and said, my team worked on that. Do you want to explain it? That moment was strange, because on the surface, it looked like he was giving me credit, but in reality, it felt like he was throwing me a bone after keeping all the meat. I answered, perfectly. The client was impressed. Rodrigo smiled, and said, that's why I have such a strong team. He didn't say my name, not once. Months went by, project after project. Same story. I created. He presented. I optimized. He took the credit. At first I rationalized it, then I ignored it. After that, I started noticing it in everything. In emails where he removed my name before forwarding them. In meetings where he talked about his strategy. In reports where he changed one word, and signed as the author. It was subtle. Subtle enough that no one else questioned it, but consistent enough that I could no longer pretend it wasn't happening. One day, in the cafeteria, a coworker said something that stuck with me. Hey, Rodrigo's amazing, right? He always has brilliant ideas. I smiled. But inside, something cracked. Because in that moment, I understood something important. He wasn't just stealing my work. He was erasing me. Like I was an invisible draft someone uses, and then throws away. And still, I stayed. For 3 years. 3 years. People always ask that afterward. Why didn't you leave sooner? Good question. Uncomfortable answer, because I wanted to be seen. Because I thought at some point someone would notice the truth. Because I was afraid to start over. And because, deep down, I still believed that if I worked hard enough, something would change. It didn't. What did change was Rodrigo. Because while I was wearing myself down in silence, he started moving up. First internal recognition, then a raise, then a promotion. And every time they congratulated him, I felt like I was watching someone win a race, running with my legs. The breaking point came the day they announced something big. Rodrigo has been promoted to Director of Strategy. Applause, smiles, pats on the back. And then they said something that made my blood run cold. In a few days, he'll have a meeting with the CEO to present his vision for the company's future. His vision, of course. That night, I didn't sleep, but not like before. This time it wasn't frustration. It was clarity. Because for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't thinking about enduring it. I was thinking about doing something. And that's when I started gathering everything. Old emails, original versions of documents, metadata, file histories, messages, dates. 3 years of work, 3 years of evidence, 3 years of silence, turned into a file. And then I made a decision that, honestly, scared me more than quitting. I was going to walk into that meeting with the CEO. No invitation, no permission, but with something Rodrigo didn't have, the truth. And proof. But what I didn't know was that the meeting wasn't going to go the way I imagined. Not even close. The morning of the meeting had a strange energy, like the whole building knew something important was about to happen, but no one could quite point to what. I knew. I had a folder on my laptop simply called Projects. Nothing flashy, nothing suspicious. But inside, there were 3 years of my life, organized with surgical precision. Emails with dates, file versions with history, original presentations, side-by-side comparisons, even recordings of internal meetings where I explained ideas, weeks before Rodrigo presented them as his own. It wasn't a gut feeling, it was a case. The problem wasn't having proof. The problem was, how the hell was I going to get into that meeting? It was a room on the executive floor. Restricted access. Important people. People who didn't have time for internal drama. But that's where something I learned over those 3 years came in. No one questions someone who looks like they know exactly where they're going. I walked toward the elevator with steady steps. Not fast. Not hesitant. Steady. Like I had every right in the world to be there. And when the doors closed, I felt it for the first time. The real hit. My heart racing. Cold hands. Doubt. Because it's one thing to plan it in your head, and a completely different thing to actually do it. I could lose my job that same day. I could burn my reputation in the entire industry. I could become the problematic one. But then I thought of something worse, staying. And that gave me enough momentum not to step out of the elevator. The executive floor was a different world. Silent. Impeccable folders. People speaking in low voices, like every word cost money. The meeting room was at the end. Glass door. Blinds half closed. And inside, I saw him. Rodrigo. Standing, his laptop connected to the screen. Calm. Confident. In his element. Like the whole world was a stage built for him. And in front of him, the CEO. I took a deep breath, counted to 3, and opened the door. The sound was minimal, but enough. They both turned. Rodrigo first. And that moment, I remember it with absurd clarity, because I saw exactly when he realized. Not everything, but something. His expression changed for half a second. Confusion, then annoyance, then that professional smile again. Yes, he said, in that tone of "this wasn't in the script." The CEO looked at me. Not annoyed, just curious. "Can you wait outside?" Rodrigo added quickly. There it was. The easy way out. The elegant way to leave without making noise. The version of me from a month ago would have taken it. But not that day. Not that day. "I think this is something you'll want to hear," I said, looking directly at the CEO. Silence. Heavy. Dense. Rodrigo took a step toward me. "This isn't the time," he said, lower. But it was no longer a suggestion. It was a warning. And that's when everything changed. Because for the first time in 3 years, I didn't look away. "With all due respect," I said, "I've spent 3 years working on the projects being presented here, and I believe there's important information about their origin." The word origin landed like a stone in still water. The CEO leaned back slightly in his chair. That was it. But it was enough. Because he didn't ask me to leave. He didn't stop me. He just said, "Go ahead." Rodrigo let out a small laugh. The kind with no humor in it. "This is ridiculous," he said. "He's confused." I didn't look at him. I opened my laptop, plugged in the cable, and projected the first slide. It was simple. 2 columns. Left, my original version of a project, with date, author, and history. Right, the version presented by Rodrigo. Same structure. Same data. Same approach. Different name. "I won't make this long," I said. "I'll show 3 examples." A lie. I had about 20, but I knew it wasn't about quantity. It was about impact. First example. I explained the process. Showed the emails. The original submission. Rodrigo's response. And then, the final presentation. The CEO didn't say anything, but he stopped looking at Rodrigo, and started looking at me. Second example. More recent. More polished. More blatant. This time I included something extra. An audio clip. An internal meeting where I explained the full strategy. 2 weeks before Rodrigo presented it as his vision. I hit play. My voice filled the room. And in that moment, something shifted. It was no longer an accusation. It was evidence. Rodrigo tried to interrupt. "This is completely out of context. There are dates," I cut in. I didn't raise my voice. But I didn't give him space. "There are versions stored on the server. Emails. Records." I moved to the next slide. Third example. The most recent. The one he had been presenting, in that very moment. Yes. That one. The project that had been on the screen before I walked in. "This," I said, pointing, "I finished 2 weeks ago." I opened the original file. Showed the history. The changes. The notes. Everything. Then I opened Rodrigo's version. And zoomed into a section. An error. Small. But mine. An error I had fixed in the final version, but that he had taken from an intermediate draft. Total silence. Rodrigo stopped talking, because there wasn't much left to say. The CEO folded his hands, looked at the screen, then at Rodrigo, then at me, and said something I didn't expect. Something that shifted everything again. Closed the door. In that moment, I knew this was no longer an interruption. It was a trial. But what happened next wasn't an instant victory. Not a cinematic moment. It was far more complicated than that. When the CEO said close the door, the air changed. Literally. Like someone had lowered the pressure inside the room. I turned, closed it, and when it clicked, I felt like I had stepped into something I wouldn't walk out of untouched. No one spoke for a few seconds. The CEO kept looking at the screen. Rodrigo wasn't smiling anymore. But he didn't look defeated either. And that worried me. Because I had made a mistake. I had assumed that if I showed the truth, everything would collapse under its own weight. But Rodrigo had been playing this game for 3 years, and he hadn't gotten there by accident. He adjusted his jacket, took a breath, and then he spoke. Calm, too calm. I understand how this might look, he said. He didn't deny anything right away. That was the first thing that threw me off. He didn't attack. He didn't defend himself with anger. He did something worse. He took control of the frame. But there's context missing, he continued, looking at the CEO, not at me. I lead a team. Ideas don't come out of nowhere. They develop, they're refined, they evolve. He paused. Then, for the first time, he looked directly at me, and said, he's part of that process. I felt the hit. It wasn't a denial. It was dilution. He was trying to turn 3 years of theft into teamwork. The material he's showing, he went on, are drafts. Early versions. It's normal for the team to contribute. He stepped closer to the screen, pointed at one of the documents. But the strategic direction, the final vision, that's what I present. And that's when he made his most dangerous move. In fact, he said, this explains something I had already noticed. Silence. Recently I've had concerns about professional boundaries within the team. I felt my chest tighten, because I knew where this was going. But hearing it, was something else. Access to sensitive materials. Files being taken out of context. Information that shouldn't be presented this way. And then he dropped the line. The one that almost flipped everything. This could be a breach of confidentiality. Boom. It was no longer boss steals work. Now it was problematic employee accesses information and uses it inappropriately. A clean shift. Elegant. Dangerous. The CEO didn't react immediately, but for the first time since I started, he looked away from the screen, and looked at me, evaluating, measuring. And in that moment, I understood something brutal. If I hesitated, if I got nervous, if I sounded emotional, I lost. I took a breath, once, slow, and decided to do something I hadn't planned. They're not drafts. My voice came out firmer than I expected. Rodrigo smiled slightly, like he had heard that before. Their final version sent to you, I continued, with dates. Copied to internal clients. I opened another folder. Deeper. More specific. And not just that. I opened an email. Projected it. Subject, final approved version. Date. Time. Recipient, Rodrigo. Attachment, the full project. This is the finished document, I said. The same one that later appears in presentations under your name. Rodrigo tried to speak, but I didn't give him time. And about confidentiality, I clicked. Another file. A system log. Access history. All of this is within the company's server, with permissions assigned by you. I looked at him, directly. I didn't take anything from where I shouldn't have. The silence returned. But this time it was different. Heavier. More uncomfortable. The CEO clasped his hands, leaned forward, and spoke for the first time in several minutes. Rodrigo. Just one word, but it sounded like a door closing. Do you want to explain it? Rodrigo opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the screen, then at me. And for the first time since I'd known him, he didn't have an immediate answer. But he wasn't done. Not even close. Because then he did something I didn't expect at all. Something that, honestly, threw me off for a second. He turned fully toward me, and said, you know what? You're right about one thing. Silence. Total. He did a large part of that work. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. Nothing. Because that wasn't surrender. It was another move. And he was setting it up. And I probably should have given him more visibility, he continued. Then he looked at the CEO. That's my responsibility. He sounded sincere, almost convincing. But it's also my responsibility to ensure coherence, quality, and strategic direction. He pointed at the screen. What he does is excellent, but it's not a final product ready for this level. There it was. Again. He didn't deny. He reinterpreted. This is not a case of theft, he said finally. It's a case of someone talented, who doesn't yet understand how things work at an executive level. And that line, that damn line, almost worked. Because he didn't attack me. He reduced me. He framed me as someone good, but immature. Someone who doesn't understand. And in a room like that, that can be enough to bury you. The CEO didn't say anything right away. He just looked at both of us, like he was seeing two versions of the same story, and deciding which one to believe. And in that moment, I knew with absolute clarity this was no longer about proof. It was about narrative. And if I didn't do something different, Rodrigo was going to win. Again. But what I did next wasn't in any plan, in any document, in any folder. And it was what finally broke everything. When Rodrigo finished speaking, the room settled into a strange balance, like a tightrope that hasn't snapped yet, but you know it's about to. What he said was dangerous precisely because of that. It made sense. It wasn't an outright lie. It was a version, carefully adjusted. And at that level, many decisions are made that way. Not based on who's right, but on which version is more believable. The CEO didn't say anything. He just rested his elbows on the table, and looked at both of us. So, he finally said, one of you says this is appropriation, and the other says it's team leadership. Silence. I need more than interpretations. There it was. The line. The point where everything gets decided. Rodrigo didn't speak. Neither did I. But for very different reasons. He was waiting. I was deciding whether to cross a line I couldn't come back from. Because up until that moment, everything I had shown was strong, but still professional. Documents, emails, versions. What I had saved was something else. I took a breath, slow, and said, then I'm going to show how those decisions are actually made. Rodrigo frowned. For the first time, without control, I opened another folder. Smaller, simpler. It didn't have many files, just one. An audio file. This is from an internal meeting 6 months ago, I said, after I delivered one of the biggest projects on the team. Rodrigo stepped forward. This is not appropriate. I hit play. My voice wasn't in it this time, only his. It's perfect, Rodrigo said in the recording. I'll use it exactly like this. Pause. Just remove Alejandro's name before sending it. It doesn't need to be there. Time froze. No one moved. No one spoke. The audio continued for a few more seconds. Soft laughter. Someone saying, okay, I'll clean it up. And then silence. I paused it. I didn't look at Rodrigo. I didn't need to. I looked at the CEO. And on his face, there was no longer curiosity. No evaluation. There was something colder. More direct. Understanding. Rodrigo tried to react. That's completely taken out of context. But this time, his voice didn't carry the same weight. Because he wasn't competing against a narrative anymore. He was competing against his own voice. What context justifies that? I asked. Without raising my voice. Without attacking. Just letting the question sit in the air. Rodrigo opened his mouth. Closed it. Looked at the CEO. And that's when I saw it. For the first time in 3 years. Fear. But not the fear of someone who feels guilty. The fear of someone who knows they've just lost control. The CEO leaned back slowly in his chair. Exhaled. Long and then he did something I didn't expect. He didn't speak to me. He didn't reprimand Rodrigo. He picked up his phone. Dialed. I need HR in the executive meeting room. Now. He hung up. Silence again. But it wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was final. Rodrigo tried one last move. Softer. More measured. We can resolve this internally, he said. I think this is being exaggerated. The CEO cut him off. Without raising his voice. Not anymore. 2 words. And just like that, it was over. But if you think this is where everything turns into perfect justice, no, not even close. Because what happened next wasn't clean, wasn't immediate, and definitely wasn't how I imagined it. In fact, at one point, I thought it was all going to come crashing down on me anyway. The minutes after that call felt endless. Nothing dramatic happened. No one shouted. No one argued. And honestly, that made it worse. Rodrigo didn't say a single word. He just stood there, looking at the table, as if he were reorganizing everything in his head at an absurd speed. I was still there too, standing. Laptop open. The audio paused on the screen, like a living piece of evidence no one could ignore. The CEO didn't speak either. He was just there, waiting, like someone who had already made a decision, but knew the process mattered more than impulse. When the knock on the door came, the atmosphere had completely shifted. 2 people from HR walked in, a woman and a man. Serious, neutral, the kind who don't react, they just register. Thank you for coming, the CEO said. He pointed to the chairs. Please, sit. No long introductions. They weren't needed. I need you to listen to this, he said, and looked at me. That moment was strange, because for the first time since I walked in, I wasn't fighting. I was backed. I pressed play again. The audio sounded the same as before. Clear, direct, impossible to dress up. HR didn't visibly react, but they looked at each other. Just for a second. Enough. Is this authentic? The woman asked. Yes, I replied. It's in the internal system. I can show the logs. She nodded, wrote something down, then looked at Rodrigo. Would you like to comment on this? That's when something interesting happened. Rodrigo didn't collapse. He didn't get defensive. He did something much smarter. Yes, he said. Silence. It's my voice. He didn't deny it. Again. But the way it's being interpreted doesn't reflect how workflow actually functions. The HR woman didn't change her expression. Explain. Rodrigo took a breath. Sat down. Took his time. In high-performance teams, he began. It's common for work to pass through multiple hands. Sometimes, to maintain coherence, authorship is centralized. It sounded good. Too good. What you're hearing is a formatting instruction, not appropriation. Again. He didn't deny. He reframed. Especially when the project needs to be presented with a single voice to clients or leadership. Silence. And then he said something I didn't expect. If I made a mistake, he added, it was not communicating that process clearly to the team. That was a precise move. Because suddenly he wasn't a villain anymore. He was someone who failed to communicate. HR wrote it down. The CEO watched him without interrupting. And that's when I realized something no one tells you even with evidence. Things don't resolve in black and white. Because now there were 2 versions on the table, mine, systematic appropriation, his poor management and lack of clarity. And in many companies, that difference changes everything. The HR woman turned to me. do you have anything else you'd like to add? That question was dangerous, because I could say too much, or not enough. And in that moment I remembered something important. This wasn't about convincing them with emotion. It was about closing the narrative. This isn't an isolated case, I said. Calm, clear. I opened the folder again. Projects. This isn't interpretation. It's a pattern. I didn't show 20 examples. I showed 3 more. Quick, direct, same dynamic, same result. And then I said something that wasn't in any document. If this were a team practice, someone else would have been credited at some point. Silence. But that's not the case. I looked at Rodrigo. It's always you. That landed differently, because it wasn't technical anymore. It was structural. The CEO stood up, slowly, walked a few steps, looked out the window. No one spoke. And then he said something that shifted everything, but not the way I expected. We're going to handle this properly. He turned. This doesn't get decided in a room in an hour. Pause. We're opening a formal investigation. That's when I felt it. The hit. Because in my head, everything ended today. But no. This was just beginning. Both of you, he continued, will submit all the documentation you have. He looked at HR. I want full access to the systems. Then back at us. And until this is resolved, a brief pause. Rodrigo is removed from any executive presentations. Silence. It wasn't a total victory, but it wasn't nothing either. It was a breaking point. And most importantly, for the first time in 3 years, Rodrigo didn't have control. But what I didn't know at that moment was that the following weeks would be even more tense than that meeting. Because when everything becomes official, people start choosing sides. And not all of them were going to choose mine. The investigation started the next day. No official announcement. No mass email. But even so, everyone knew. Offices have this strange way of leaking information. No one has to tell you anything. You feel it. In the way voices drop when you walk by. In how someone stops typing when you get close. In the looks that last half a second longer than usual. I showed up that day like always. Same time. Same coffee. But nothing was the same. My access to certain systems had changed. Not blocked, but monitored. Every file I opened. Every document I downloaded. Everything was being logged. No one told me. I noticed. And that was the first real hit, because up until then, I felt like the one who had done the right thing. But now, I was also a suspect. Rodrigo wasn't there. Officially, on operational pause. Unofficially, no one knew. What was there was his shadow. Because his team was still around. And many of them weren't happy with me. The first to approach me was Luis. We'd worked together for over a year. We were never friends, but there was respect. Hey, he said in the cafeteria, lowering his voice. What did you do? It wasn't curiosity. It was a warning. Told the truth, I replied. Luis sighed. Yeah, but that's not how this works. There it was again. That phrase. That invisible logic. Rodrigo gave us stability, he continued. Big clients. Steady projects. I looked at him. At what cost? I asked. He shrugged. That's just how it is. I didn't argue. But in that moment, I understood something important. Not everyone wants things to be fair. A lot of people just want things to work. And I had just broken something that worked. The next few days were heavy. HR started calling people in, one by one, private meetings, closed doors. They called me in on the second day. Small room, no windows, round table. The same woman from before, and someone else with a laptop. We're going to go through everything, she said. And we did. 4 hours. They asked for exact dates, context for each project, how the work was distributed, how files were delivered. Nothing aggressive, but meticulous. Every time I said something, they cross-checked it. Can you prove that? Do you have backup? Who else was present? It wasn't enough to be right. You had to prove it, piece by piece. I walked out of that room exhausted, like my brain had been wrung out. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst came after. Because that same afternoon, I got a message. Unknown number. We should talk. I didn't reply. 5 minutes later, this is getting out of control. I knew before opening the next message. It was Rodrigo. We can fix this without anyone else getting affected. I stared at the screen. Because that line had a double edge. I didn't respond. A minute later. You don't need to take this any further. And then. Think about your future. There it was. Not a direct threat, but close. I closed the chat. Didn't answer. But that night, I didn't sleep. Because for the first time since all this started, I doubted. Not the evidence. Not what happened. I doubted whether it was worth it. Because it wasn't just him anymore. It was the environment. The team. The tension. The very real possibility of being labeled the one who caused problems. And that idea gets into your head like humidity. Silent, but constant. On the third day, something happened that I didn't expect. Carla came to find me. She was close. One of the few people I talked to outside of work. She sat in front of me. No small talk. Dash, they're going to try to close this as a misunderstanding. Dash, I looked at her. Dash, how do you know? Dash, because they've done it before. Dash, silence. Dash, before, I asked. Dash, she nodded. Dash, about a year ago. It wasn't as big, but someone complained about something similar. Dash, a chill ran through me. Dash, and what happened? Dash, he left. Dash, just like that. Dash, they didn't fire him, she added. But they moved him, reduced his projects, until he quit. Dash, that's when I understood the whole game. Dash, they don't always destroy you directly. Sometimes, they just make you uncomfortable until you leave on your own. Dash, Carla looked at me. Dash, if you're going to keep going, you need to be ready for that. Dash, I didn't answer. Dash, because in that moment, I wasn't sure. Dash, but what I didn't know was that the next call was going to change everything again. Dash, and this time, it wasn't going to be HR. The fourth day of the investigation started like the previous ones. Heavy, slow, like walking with wet clothes on. Dash, I was already in autopilot mode. Arrive. Do the minimum work. Reply only when necessary. Avoid long eye contact. Dash, and then, I got an internal call. Unknown number. Short extension. I answered. Dash, Alejandro. The voice was calm. Older. Dash, yes. Dash, this is Martin. From Systems. Dash, it took me a second to place him. Martin wasn't someone you normally talk to. He was one of those people who are there, but not really there. Always in the background. Fixing things. Access. Servers. Dash, do you have a minute? He asked. Dash, I hesitated. But something in his tone wasn't casual. Dash, yes. Dash, come to the server room. Level -1. And he hung up. Dash, I stared at the phone. Level -1 wasn't somewhere you just went. No desks. No meetings. Just racks, cables, and constant cold air. Dash, and still, I went. Dash, access was by card. Heavy door. Constant white noise. Dash, Martin was there. Sitting in front of a laptop. Dash, when I walked in, he looked up. Dash, close it. Dash, I did. Dash, no long greeting. No introduction. He just turned the screen toward me. Dash, they're monitoring your access, he said. Dash, I nodded. Dash, but not just yours. Dash, I frowned. Dash, Rodrigo's too. Dash, silence. Dash, and something doesn't add up. My heart started beating faster. Dash, what is it? Dash, Martin clicked. Opened a log. Dates. Times. Users. Dash, there are file accesses that don't match what he said. He pointed at the screen. These projects. Dash, I recognized them instantly. Dash, he said those were team versions, right? Dash, I nodded. Dash, then explain this. He zoomed in on a line. Dash, user, Rodrigo. Action, file access. Time, 2:13 a.m. Location, remote. Dash, that file, Martin said, was not in any shared folder at that time. Dash, I felt a small in my chest. Dash, so he opened it, from your personal folder. Dash, silence. Dash, without permission. Dash, that's when everything changed again. Dash, because up until that moment, the case was someone takes teamwork and presents it as theirs. Dash, but this was something else. Dash, unauthorized access. Dash, Martin continued. Dash, it's not an isolated case. Dash, click. Another log. Another date. Another early morning. Another one of my files. Dash, and then another. And another. Dash, this has been going on for a while, he said. Dash, I stared at the screen. Because suddenly, everything made sense. Dash, the intermediate versions. The mistakes only I had. The perfect timing. Dash, it wasn't coincidence. Dash, he had been watching me. Copying. Adjusting. Dash, like someone walking into a stranger's kitchen at night, tasting the dishes, then opening their own restaurant with the same menu. Dash, I looked up. Dash, does HR know this? Dash, Martin shook his head. Dash, not yet. Dash, silence. Dash, why are you showing me this? Dash, Martin leaned back in his chair. Dash, because this isn't the first time I've seen something like this. Dash, there it was again. Dash, with him. I asked. Dash, not exactly, he said. But similar. Dash, pause. Dash, and because this time, someone decided to do something about it. Dash, we stayed silent for a few seconds. Dash, the sound of servers filled the room like a constant hum. Dash, if this enters the investigation, he said finally, it's no longer just about credit. I looked at him. Dash, it's a serious problem. Dash, I nodded. Dash, can you back it up? Dash, he smiled slightly. Dash, I work in systems. Dash, fair enough. Dash, but then he added something I didn't expect. Dash, but you need to decide if you want to use it. Dash, I frowned. Dash, why wouldn't I? Dash, because this wasn't just exposing someone anymore. Dash, it was destroying them. Legally, even. And that changes the rules. Dash, if you bring this in, Martin said, there's no going back. Dash, silence. Dash, they won't be able to close it as miscommunication anymore. Dash, I looked at the screen again. Dash, the dates. The times. The evidence. Dash, it was all there. 3 years condensed into lines of code. Dash, and for the first time since this began, I had real control over how it would end. Dash, but also, the weight of deciding how far I was willing to take it. Dash, because sometimes, winning isn't just telling the truth. It's deciding how much you're willing to break for it to be heard. Dash, I left the server room with a copy of everything. Dash, and that night, I didn't open my laptop. Dash, I just lay there staring at the ceiling. Thinking. Dash, because the next HR meeting was less than 24 hours away. Dash, and whatever I brought into that room was going to define the end of this story. Dash for everyone. The night before the meeting, I didn't make the decision. The decision made me. I opened the laptop, looked at the folder, projects, and next to it, the new one, the one Martine had given me. It didn't have a fancy name, just a date. I opened it, and there they were again. The accesses, the impossible hours, the file paths. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't open to interpretation. It was technical, cold, irrefutable. And that's when I understood something that removed my last doubt. This was no longer just about me. Because if he had done this to me for 3 years, how many other times had he done it? With who else? I closed the laptop, and I decided. The meeting was at 10 a.m. Same small room, same table. But this time, the atmosphere was different. No longer exploratory. It was tense. HR was there. The CEO wasn't. And Rodrigo was. When I walked in, he didn't look at me. He looked different. More serious. More calculated. Like someone who had already prepared his next move. "Thank you for coming," the HR woman said. I nodded. Sat down. "We're going to continue the review," she added. Rodrigo spoke first. "Before we proceed," he said, "I want to make something clear." I looked at him. I acknowledged there were issues in how team recognition was handled. Interesting. And I'm willing to correct that. Even more interesting. But I also believe this has been escalated unnecessarily. There it was. And that there's an interpretation that doesn't reflect the real intention of the work. Silence. He was trying to close it. Again. Turn everything into, "Yes, I made mistakes, but it's not that serious." The HR woman nodded slightly. Noted. Then she looked at me. "Do you want to add anything?" There it was. The moment. I could have stopped there. Accepted that version. Let it become an internal adjustment. Walked out clean. No noise. But then I remembered 2:13 a.m. The late nights. The accesses. And I knew. "No," I said. "We're not done." I opened the laptop. Rodrigo looked up. For the first time since I entered, I connected the cable. Screen on. "This isn't about recognition," I continued. Click. The first record appeared. User, Rodrigo. Access, private folder. Time, 2:13 a.m. Immediate silence. The HR woman frowned. "What is this?" "It's not a team version," I said. "It's direct access to personal files. Without permission." Rodrigo leaned forward. "That doesn't prove anything." Click. Another record. Another date. Another early morning. "This is a pattern," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Off-hours access. To folders that weren't shared. The room felt colder. Literally. Because now we weren't talking about interpretation anymore. We were talking about permissions. Boundaries. Something with actual rules. The HR woman looked at Rodrigo. "Did you have authorized access to these locations?" Silence. That silence was different from all the others. Because it wasn't strategic. It was dangerous. Rodrigo exhaled. "In my position," he started. "It's normal to review team materials with explicit permission," she interrupted. Direct. No hesitation. Rodrigo paused. Just a second. But it was enough. "Not in all cases," he admitted. That was it. Everything cracked. The HR woman stopped writing. The other person looked up for the first time. And I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. Because at that moment, the story changed categories. It was no longer a workplace dispute. It was a serious issue. Very serious. The meeting ended differently than all the others. No closure. No summary. Just one line, "This escalates." That same afternoon, things moved fast. Rodrigo was escorted out of the building. Not fired, but removed. His system access was suspended, and for the first time in 3 years, his name stopped appearing on active projects. But if you think that's where it ends cleanly, no. Because what came next was the most unexpected part of all. Something that had nothing to do with him. It had to do with me. And it almost made all of this not worth it. When everything blew up, I thought the hardest part was already over. Wrong. The following days were strange. Too quiet. Rodrigo didn't come back. His desk stayed empty. Screen off. Chair perfectly aligned, like someone tried to erase his presence with order. But his absence made more noise than when he was there. No one talked about it directly. But everyone knew. Rumors ran through the office like live wires. "He got removed. He's under investigation. They say it's serious." And then there was me. People didn't avoid me anymore. But they didn't approach me the same way either. It was like I had become something uncomfortable. The guy who told the truth. Yes. But also, the guy who broke the balance. Some looked at me with respect. Others, with caution. And you feel that. A week later, they called me in. Same room. But this time it was different. The HR woman was there. The other guy. And the CEO. "That already tells you a lot." "Thank you for coming," he said. I nodded. Sat down. No delays. "We have concluded the preliminary investigation." Preliminary. That word already gave me a hint. Unauthorized access to restricted materials has been confirmed. Direct. Clear. And a consistent pattern of presenting work without proper attribution. There it was. Black on white. Rodrigo had lost. But what came next wasn't what I expected. Rodrigo will no longer continue with the company. Silence. Done. End. Right? No. Because the CEO continued. Now, there is something we need to discuss with you. That small hit landed immediately. Dash, during the review, he said, we found that you collected and stored a considerable amount of internal information. Of course. Dash, we understand the context, he added. But it's also important how these processes are handled. There it was. The turn. Dash, it wasn't an attack. But it wasn't praise either. Dash, you acted outside formal channels. True. Dash, and while the outcome exposed a real issue, the method also matters. Silence. Dash, and then they said the line I didn't expect. Dash, this is considered a minor violation of internal protocols. Minor. But still a violation. Dash, and that's when I understood the most uncomfortable part of all of this, doing the right thing doesn't always leave you clean. Dash, no formal sanction will be applied, he continued. But there will be a note in your record. Dash, a warning. A small word, but heavy. Because it stays. And it can show up, exactly when you don't want it to. Dash, I left that room with a strange feeling. Rodrigo was gone. The truth was out. But I wasn't exactly in the same place either. Dash, the following days were quiet. Fewer projects. More distance. I wasn't isolated. But I wasn't pushed forward either. It was like the company didn't quite know what to do with me. Dash, and then, 2 weeks later, something came from outside. Dash, an email arrived. Subject, we'd like to speak with you. It was from another company. Big. Very big. Dash, and the strange part, I hadn't applied. Dash, the interview was direct. No detours. We know what happened, they said. That's when I understood. Things leak. Always. Dash, and we value integrity, the interviewer added. That word again. But now, it sounded different. Dash, 2 weeks later, I had an offer. Better position. Better salary. And something more important, a place where I didn't have to fight to exist. Dash, the day I resigned, no one was surprised. The HR woman just nodded. We understand. And that was it. No drama. No epic closure. Just, the end of a chapter. Dash, if I took anything from all of this, it wasn't a pretty lesson. It was something harsher. Sometimes, telling the truth doesn't fix the system, but it does get you out of one that was already broken for you. Dash, and that, even if it doesn't feel like a perfect victory, is enough.